This beautiful copy of the Tao Te Ching is my father's, and I borrowed it for the purpose of making this review, so I didn't have to buy one myself. This is an incredible book. Fewer than 100 poems/lessons from over 2,000 years ago that still hold great merit today. I have many thoughts on the text, and on this English version by Stephen Mitchell. Note how I didn't say translation. We'll get to that later. Starting with the history of the text, the author himself, Lao Tzu, most likely didn't exist. In the same vein as the Iliad, the Tao Te Ching seems to come out of a long oral tradition. An Ping Chin, in the introduction exclusive to this edition, another bonus from borrowing it, says that Lao Tzu existed only as a collective idea from an old master tradition. So it seems the wisdom in this book evolved over time and through the perspective of many different ancient people. So what is the Tao? It seems to be some universal force. It also means the way. It's hard to pin it down exactly, and this is acknowledged in the first chapter of the book. So to try to explain the Tao as a concept is to constrict it, for the true Tao just is. The way I understood it, to live in balance with the Tao means to live in a way where you disappear into the Tao completely and become its conduit. I'll quote a passage from Stephen Mitchell's introduction. It's a bit long, but it explains the Tao better than I can. A good athlete can enter a state of body awareness in which the right stroke or the right movement happens by itself, effortlessly, without any interference of the conscious will. This is a paradigm for non-action, the purest and most effective form of action. The game plays the game. The poem writes the poem. We can't tell the dancer from the dance. Nothing is done because the doer has vanished wholeheartedly into the deed. The fuel has been completely transformed into flame. This nothing is, in fact, everything. It happens when we trust the intelligence of the universe in the same way that an athlete or a dancer trusts the superior intelligence of the body. Lao Tzu's central figure is a man or woman whose life is in perfect harmony with the way things are. The master has mastered nature, not in the sense of conquering it, but of becoming it. In surrendering to the Tao and giving up all concepts, judgments, and desires, her mind has grown naturally compassionate. She finds deep in her own experience the central truths of the art of living, which are paradoxical only on the surface. That the more truly solitary we are, the more compassionate we can be. The more we let go of what we love, the more present our love becomes. The clearer our insight into what is beyond good and evil, the more we can embody the good, until finally she is able to say, in all humility, I am the Tao, the truth, the life. To put it in an extremely oversimplified, blunt way, lacking all subtlety, it's about going with the flow. The book is structured into 3 general parts, not explicitly broken up that way, but the lessons seem to shift that way, with a few outliers. The first few chapters are about the Tao itself. Then most of the book is how an individual can act in accordance with the Tao. And finally, the back part of the book explains how a country or community can live in accordance with the Tao. Obviously, the reader must have some concept of the Tao before they can change their life to fit it better. The long quote from the foreword quite clearly explains the idea of the Tao, but the text itself is more subtle. The Tao itself is described as mysterious and unnameable. So the chapters, each nugget of wisdom is called a chapter, even though none of them is longer than a single page. Like many spiritual guides, are heavy with metaphor. The Tao can't be fully explained straightforwardly, because if you think it's something simple to grasp, you've missed the true Tao, and understood only a human interpretation. To get the reader closer to an understanding of the true Tao, the book uses its metaphors to get the reader to riddle out many different ideas of it. In wrestling with these ideas, the reader is wrestling with the Tao, and slowly coming to understand it better. A good example is Chapter 5. The Tao doesn't take sides. It gives birth to both good and evil. The Master doesn't take sides. She welcomes both saints and sinners. The Tao is like a bellows. It is empty, yet infinitely capable. The more you use it, the more it produces. The more you talk of it, the less you understand. Hold on to the center. Once a greater understanding of the Tao has been achieved, the book moves on to the next section. I said earlier this section was about acting in accordance with the Tao. This is true. It's also a guide for the reader on how to think about things. Thoughts influence actions, and so the reader is called upon to think differently than they normally would. My favorite examples of this are 3 chapters that seem inextricably linked. Understanding one helps you understand the others, with the third being the key to the lesson. So let's analyze these. We'll start with chapter 18.
When the great Tao is forgotten, goodness and piety appear. When the body's intelligence declines, cleverness and knowledge step forth. When there is no peace in the family, filial piety begins. When the country falls into chaos, patriotism is born.
So what do these contradictions mean? First, I think it has to be understood that these are not positive outcomes. They are negative ones. They also happen to be commonly held as virtues. So why are they bad? Let's take it step by step.
When the great Tao is forgotten, goodness and piety appear.
The Tao gives birth to good and bad. We are told in one chapter that the Tao does not take sides. When we lose sight of the way, we only have our own judgments to guide us. And those are not eternal. They are flawed.
When the body's intelligence declines, cleverness and knowledge step forth.
Here the body's intelligence refers to the second nature of actions, such as the section of the foreword I quoted earlier. We can't tell the dancer from the dance. Mitchell also tells us in the foreword to trust the intelligence of the universe in the same way. So here, when we lose that trust, that ability to act naturally and purely reactively to the way, that is when cleverness and knowledge are born. They are not reactive forces. They are proactive ones. They categorize things and impose their own will, and this clouds the way.
When there is no peace in the family, filial piety begins.
So why is this wrong? It's not that the actions filial piety entails are wrong, but the way they come about can be. If everyone in a family were to act in accordance with the Tao, everyone would fulfill their roles naturally, not out of a need to follow a cultural tradition. It is only when family members are not treating each other properly that piety must be imposed so that people feel that they must follow it.
When the country falls into chaos, patriotism is born.
Now that we've broken down the rest of this chapter, you may have an idea of what I'm going to say in regards to this. It's the family writ large, though maybe with an extra element. I think so, at least. If every person followed the Tao, they would do what was natural and fill their roles, and everything would get done. It is only when people don't fill their roles and things don't get done that pressure has to be applied. Here that being the pressure of duty, having to convince people what they owe to their country, playing on debt and guilt. The extra bit that I think applies here has to do with a different type of chaos. In following the way, there is no need for patriotism, as there is no need for pride. If a country is to fall into turmoil, the citizens may feel guilt or fear or shame. In the presence of these emotions, the citizens may employ patriotism as a shield, fighting against the shame they feel with pride. Funny as it may sound, this actually reminds me of a quote from Avatar: The Last Airbender, when Zuko, a character with great inner turmoil, tells his uncle, Iroh, that he's prouder than ever. Iroh responds by telling him that pride is not the opposite of shame, but its source. The very next chapter, 19, is similar in style, but expressed differently.
Throw away holiness and wisdom, and people will be 100 times happier. Throw away morality and justice, and people will do the right thing. Throw away industry and profit, and there won't be any thieves. If these three aren't enough, just stay at the center of the circle, and let all things take their course.
Why would people be happier after throwing away holiness and wisdom? Again, I think it's because they're concepts. Holiness implies a right and wrong way of doing things, and wisdom of right and wrong allows for judgment. Other parts of the Tao Te Ching discuss being free from judgment. If people live naturally and without judgment, they will be happier.
Throw away morality and justice, and people will do the right thing.
Here, right means in accordance with the Tao, so it's similar to the first part of the chapter. But why would morality and justice be in opposition to the Tao? I'll explain more after reviewing the next chapter.
Throw away industry and profit, and there won't be any thieves.
Living for money is not in accordance with the Tao. So you could say that the way the entire world is structured today is antithetical to the way. The text seems to make it clear that any system focused solely on material things goes against the Tao. My guess is that in following the way, what was intended is for people to follow their natural roles, which at the time meant whatever was expected of their class within the feudal system. Though perhaps if the Tao was truly followed by all, there would be no need for political systems of any kind.
If these three aren't enough, just stay at the center of the circle, and let all things take their course.
Staying in the center is a recurring theme, like staying in the eye of a hurricane, where it's calm. If you stray to the edges, you get whipped around in the storm. So if in achieving these three things there are still problems, or if you can't achieve them all because they are beyond your control, stay centered in the Tao. So chapter 18 was about the loss of positive things and the appearance of negative things in their place. And chapter 19 was about the negative things that we should throw away and the positive things that will naturally arise to replace them. The positives expressed in both are similar, and it all gets tied together in chapter 38.
The master doesn't try to be powerful. Thus, he is truly powerful. The ordinary man keeps reaching for power. Thus, he never has enough. The master does nothing, yet he leaves nothing undone. The ordinary man is always doing things, yet many more are left to be done. The kind man does something, yet something remains undone. The just man does something, and leaves many things to be done. The moral man does something, and when no one responds, he rolls up his sleeves and uses force. When the Tao is lost, there is goodness. When goodness is lost, there is morality. When morality is lost, there is ritual. Ritual is the husk of true faith, the beginning of chaos. Therefore, the master concerns himself with the depths and not the surface, with the fruit and not the flower. He has no will of his own. He dwells in reality and lets all illusions go.
This whole chapter is important, but I actually want to start with the penultimate verse. There's morality popping up again, like in chapter 19. So after the other two chapters, maybe you see what's going on here. After losing the natural harmony of the Tao, goodness arises. People don't act naturally, but in a way they consider positive. Morality follows the loss of goodness. Most people would see morality as good. But here goodness exists without badness. It is merely people acting in a way they perceive as positive. Morality is beyond that. It's a code of how to act. It is not just that there are good acts, but with morality, if people abstain from actions considered good, or commit to actions considered bad, there is punishment. Ritual is a husk because there is no thought behind it, not even an intention to do good or avoid bad. We have forgotten even our own concepts of right and wrong, and this is our last-ditch attempt to prevent ourselves from falling into disaster. So we do what we've always done, because it seems to have worked well enough before, and we don't want to risk anything. So we go from acting naturally, to acting out of a desire to do good, to acting out of a desire to avoid punishment, to acting merely for the sake of acting. Now that we've examined that verse, I'll jump back to the second one.
The master does nothing, yet he leaves nothing undone. The ordinary man is always doing things, yet many more are left to be done.
Now that we have a better idea of how straying from the Tao introduces more and more complex concepts, we can see here that the master leaves nothing undone because he doesn't have a set list of things to do. He merely flows with the Tao. The man of concepts, though, he does not flow. He has many concepts, and so does many things and leaves many things undone. All this should make the third verse clear now.
The kind man does something, yet something remains undone.
This is like the goodness that follows when losing the Tao. It's close to the Tao, so the concept is simple. Therefore, only one thing remains undone.
The just man does something, and leaves many things to be done.
We've strayed further from the Tao here. The concepts of how we should act have gotten more complex. We don't just act because we're kind. We judge our own actions and have more things to do, and so more things are left undone.
The moral man does something, and when no one responds, he rolls up his sleeves and uses force.
As discussed in the fourth verse, morality implies judgment and punishment. It is no longer just things done and not done. Now part of what we do is use force to make people do what we think is the right thing, and punish those who don't obey. And so the list of tasks to be done has grown exponentially. And so here we come to the key.
Therefore the master concerns himself with the depths and not the surface, with the fruit and not the flower.
These layers between depths and surface exist in all three chapters, but are most layered here in verse 4. We start from the deepest depths with the Tao, but by the time we reach ritual, we have been pulled up so we can only see the surface level. The Tao is what is deep and enduring. It is the fruit, for the flower can be complex and beautiful, but it cannot sustain us, and it distracts us from what can.
He has no will of his own. He dwells in reality, and lets all illusions go.
Concepts are illusions. We made them up to categorize things and make them easier to understand. To dwell in reality,
We must give them up and live in the darkness of mystery. The end of chapter 1 says that mystery and manifestations arise from the same source. This source is called darkness. Darkness within darkness, the gateway to all understanding. Chapter 41 touches on this darkness, and we learn from one line, "The path into the light seems dark." It is scary to give up what we think we know, our concepts, and exist in the dark. But it is only by shedding old ideas that we can be open. In his note on chapter 1, Mitchell says of the source, "The less we obstruct it, the more radiant we are." Alright, so now we've gone in depth into a few chapters on how to think and act, and we've explored how to analyze them. The last type of chapter I mentioned earlier is how a country should act and how to govern. I'll recite a chapter as example, but won't go so deep into it again. I'll leave it up to you to interpret, though this chapter is more straightforward than the previous ones. Governing a large country is like frying a small fish. You spoil it with too much poking. Center your country in the Tao, and evil will have no power. Not that it isn't there, but you'll be able to step out of its way. Give evil nothing to oppose, and it will disappear by itself. Also, by the way, the famous quote, "The journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step," is also from this book. Chapter 64. Though in the version I have, it's written as, "The journey of 1,000 miles starts from beneath your feet." It's a great chapter, but I'll leave finding and reading it up to you. I've gone over enough of them for now. This book is an exciting challenge to the way we think and act, with a robust philosophy on how to live expressed simply and elegantly. That being said, I do have some complicated thoughts on the version I read. Remember earlier when I called this a version and not a translation? That's because Stephen Mitchell does not understand ancient Chinese. To create this version, he worked from a literal translation and, as he puts it, consulted dozens of translations into English, German, and French. Though he says what most prepared him to take on this challenge is a 14 years long course of Zen training, which, as he puts it, brought me face to face with Lao Tzu and his true disciples and heirs, the early Chinese Zen masters. This is the first thing that struck me as odd. I'm by no means an expert on this subject, but as I understand it, the heirs to Lao Tzu would be the followers of Taoism. I tried looking into this a bit, but couldn't find anything saying that Zen Buddhism was descended from it too, though apparently Zen is closer to Taoism than regular Buddhism is. Even so, it is an offshoot of a different religion, which has its basis in a different set of religious texts. I'm sure those 14 years gave Mitchell some good insights into the writings of the Tao Te Ching, but I think it's odd he views it the way he does. His version was published in 1987, so perhaps Zen was the closest he could get at the time, in the pre-internet era. All that being said, I accepted this version for what it was. Now I will quote Mitchell on his intentions of his crafting of this version. "With great poetry, the freest translation is sometimes the most faithful. I have often been fairly literal, or as literal as one can be with such a subtle, kaleidoscopic book as the Tao Te Ching. But I have also paraphrased, expanded, contracted, interpreted, worked with the text, played with it, until it became embodied in a language that felt genuine to me. If I haven't always translated Lao Tzu's words, my intention has always been to translate his mind." I think that's a noble goal. When it comes to literature, you don't want a literal translation because the poetry and symbolism present in the original language can be lost that way. The best translation is one that has those elements still present in it, preserving the spirit of the original. That's what Mitchell is trying to do here, and I appreciate that. I will say that I don't think he always succeeds. Many times he does. Or at least it seems that way to me, but I don't speak ancient Chinese either, so I may be wrong. In his notes, he mentions many of the times he was loose with the text, and he gives the literal translation to show how he's changed it. I very much appreciate these inclusions, but sometimes after reading them, it seems to me that he's gone too far. Mitchell writes chapter 42 like this: "The Tao gives birth to one. One gives birth to two. Two gives birth to three. Three gives birth to all things. All things have their backs to the female and stand facing the male. When male and female combine, all things achieve harmony. Ordinary men hate solitude, but the master makes use of it, embracing his aloneness, realizing he is one with the whole universe." The chapter makes sense and sounds nice, but when I went to check the note, I saw that Mitchell had improvised the last verse. The second verse was also changed slightly. Originally, they read, "The 10,000 things carry the yin and embrace the yang. Through the blending of the energy of these two, they achieve harmony." People hate to be orphans, widowers, starvelings, yet kings and princes take these names as their titles. Therefore, sometimes you gain by losing, sometimes you lose by gaining. What others have taught, I teach also. The violent will not die a natural death. I will make this the father of my teaching. The second verse is similar enough. Yin and yang are often associated with male and female, so pretty close there. But the third verse seems very different. The literal translation seems much more about balance and harmony, which is what the second verse is all about. The Mitchell version saying, "Ordinary men hate solitude, but the master makes use of it," seems to be trying to make a more straightforward version of kings and princes basing their titles on things people generally don't like to be. In the same way they make use of those titles, the master makes use of solitude. But in my view, Mitchell's version here comes off more like a teaching on how to do things than an example of balance. The literal version's next line clarifies even further, with the next line about gaining by losing and losing by gaining. Mitchell's version ends here with the line, "embracing his aloneness, realizing he is one with the whole universe." This oneness is similar to harmony, but the master realizing his oneness is not the same as acting harmoniously. One is thought and one is action. The literal translation ends, "The violent will not die a natural death. I will make this the father of my teaching." This is showing the idea that how you act will determine your future, as those who act violently will die violently. Similar to the saying, "Those who live by the sword will die by the sword," from the Gospel of Matthew. Using violence as the metaphor here is also a subtle call to non-violence, as this is an important point brought up in other chapters of the Tao Te Ching, such as chapter 31. Weapons are the tools of violence. All decent men detest them. Weapons are the tools of fear. A decent man will avoid them except in the direst necessity and, if compelled, will use them only with the utmost restraint. He enters a battle gravely, with sorrow and with great compassion, as if he were attending a funeral. This literal translation puts a huge emphasis on this point, which is totally absent from the Mitchell version. Lao Tzu says, "I will make this the father of my teaching." This last verse extols the virtue of balance, but also the virtue of nonviolence, and explicitly states they are the most important things. Mitchell's version has some balance in it, but no nod to nonviolence or mention of the importance of these two. I think I understand why he did it this way. His chapters are in verse, and this chapter is 3 verses with 4 lines each. If he tried to fit any more information in, the poetry of the chapter would be thrown off. I think he should have arranged this poem differently though, as I feel he missed a very important point, though I give him credit for putting this information in the notes at least. The other one that's a bit loose is chapter 61. When a country obtains great power, it becomes like the sea. All streams run downward into it. The more powerful it grows, the greater the need for humility. Humility means trusting the Tao, thus never needing to be defensive. A great nation is like a great man. When he makes a mistake, he realizes it. Having realized it, he admits it. Having admitted it, he corrects it. He considers those who point out his faults as his most benevolent teachers. He thinks of his enemy as the shadow that he himself casts. If a nation is centered in the Tao, if it nourishes its own people and doesn't meddle in the affairs of others, it will be a light to all nations in the world. Let's compare that to the literal version. A large country is like the lower part of a river. It is the meeting point of the universe, the female of the universe. The female, by tranquility, conquers the male. By tranquility she takes the lower position. Therefore a large country by placing itself in a lower position can conquer a small country. A small country by being in a lower position can conquer a large country. Therefore, the one conquers by placing itself lower. The other conquers by being naturally lower. A large country wants nothing more than to gather people and nourish them. A small country wants nothing more than to enter and serve the people. Since both get what they want, the large country should take the lower position. I can see verse 1 and a bit of verse 3 of Mitchell's version working here, such as his version, never needing to be defensive, and the literal version, therefore a large country by placing itself in a lower position can conquer a small country by being in a lower position can conquer a large country. This is similar to the ending of chapter 69. When two great forces oppose each other, the victory will go to the one that knows how to yield. Thus Mitchell's version of never needing to be defensive. Verse 2, though, looks to me like Mitchell's personal interpretation of what it means to be tranquil and place yourself lower. I like all the things he comes up with, and agree they would be good. I'm just not sure if they were things intended by the text. It's hard to say for sure, and this chapter seems closer to its original to me. But this shows the type of interpreting that is done in this version, so just be aware of that. There's also stuff like chapter 46, the first verse of which reads, when a country is in harmony with the Tao, the factories make trucks and tractors. When a country goes counter to the Tao, warheads are stockpiled outside the cities. I understand the intention of wanting to get the point across, but factories, trucks, tractors, and warheads? I don't think they had any of these things in ancient China. Why not use a less anachronistic metaphor, like a stockpile of swords? A final nitpick. In chapter 58, Mitchell seems to be using the text to make a critique of Nietzsche, which is a bit weird. He notes that he improvised the second verse, and his version reads, when the will to power is in charge, the higher the ideals, the lower the results. Try to make people happy, and you lay the groundwork for misery. Try to make people moral, and you lay the groundwork for vice. The will to power is not a phrase used in the original, but is a foundational belief in Nietzsche's philosophy. It is a belief that flies in the face of the Tao. So if Mitchell is a big believer in the Tao, I can see why he'd disagree with it, though to me it comes off as odd that he would take a jab at him in the text itself. A final thing worth mentioning is that a bit of Christianity seems to seep through in Mitchell's version, which obviously would not have been an influence on the original. A good example is a line that I quoted from the foreword earlier, where Mitchell expresses how someone at one with the Tao would be, with that person saying, I am the Tao, the truth, the life. This is almost an exact quote from Jesus. And of course, one translation of Tao is way, so really it's just a direct quote. In the notes, he also explains parts of many chapters by comparing them to verses from the Bible. His dedication to his wife at the beginning of the book is a quote from the Bible, and he's also written or made English versions of Christian books, the Book of Job and the Gospel according to Jesus. It could just be that Christianity is an easy reference point for him to make comparisons, or he could have thought that those types of comparisons would have been easiest for readers to understand. I don't think he's let it influence the text itself, so I don't see anything wrong with making use of these quotations in the notes, but I thought it was something worth knowing. All things considered, I still like this translation. I think the chapters flow well and are written well, and though Mitchell can be a bit loose, I think for the most part he managed to do what he expressed in his foreword, translate Lao Tzu's mind if not always his words. Perhaps I'm wrong. I don't plan on ever learning ancient Chinese, so I'll never read the original version, but from the perspective of this Tao layman, I think this version is worth reading. Alright, I've analyzed the Tao Te Ching and given my views on this version of it, but I also want to mention some fun connections I've drawn after reading this book as well. There are a lot of parts of this book that remind me of Star Wars. I know that George Lucas was greatly inspired by mythology and the monomyth, so perhaps he was also inspired by the Tao Te Ching. Maybe he said as much before, I don't know. For a good example of similarities though, here's chapter 77. As it acts in the world, the Tao is like the bending of a bow. The top is bent downward, the bottom is bent up. It adjusts excess and deficiency so that there is perfect balance. It takes from what is too much and gives to what isn't enough. Those who try to control, who use force to protect their power, go against the direction of the Tao. They take from those who don't have enough and give to those who have far too much. The master can keep giving because there is no end to her wealth. She acts without expectation, succeeds without taking credit, and doesn't think that she is better than anyone else. This obviously conjures up images of the Jedi and the Sith, those who live in balance and those who try to force things. This is why balance between the number of Jedi and number of Sith does not mean balance of the Force. The Jedi without the Sith are the balance. They live in balance, not forcing things, allowing the Force to work through them and responding naturally. As Mitchell writes in his note, a possible translation of chapter 1 is, The force that can be forced is not the eternal force. That is why Anakin did not bring balance to the Force when he evened the number of Jedi and Sith. As long as the Sith exist, the Force is out of balance, as they try to force it. It is when he kills the Emperor that Anakin brings balance to the Force, as that is when all the Sith have died, and so there is no one to bend the Force to their own will, resulting in its balance. Also, when it comes to Game of Thrones, or as the book series is called, A Song of Ice and Fire, George R.R. Martin borrows from mythologies all over the world. Knowing that, perhaps he was inspired by Chapter 41 when he wrote the prophetic advice that Quaithe gives to Daenerys. To go north, you must journey south. To reach the west, you must go east. To go forward, you must go back. And to touch the light, you must pass beneath the shadow. And the second verse of Chapter 41 reads, "Thus it is said, the path into the light seems dark. The path forward seems to go back. The direct path seems long, true power seems weak, true purity seems tarnished, true steadfastness seems changeable, true clarity seems obscure. The greatest art seems unsophisticated, the greatest love seems indifferent, the greatest wisdom seems childish." Of course, that kind of saying about the indirect path is all over the place, so perhaps he was inspired by a different source or an amalgamation of them, but I think it's fun to note the similarity. Those are all my thoughts on the Tao Te Ching as of now. I really enjoyed reading and analyzing it, and it's made me want to look at things differently, and perhaps change my actions a bit too. I don't aim to follow it completely, but I suppose total adherence would also be missing the point. I definitely recommend reading it though. Its philosophy seems a good salve for the pains of the modern world, with its views on how to direct one's thoughts and actions. Definitely more helpful than any self-help book would be. If any of you have read the Tao Te Ching, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments and see if you have a different interpretation. This was the first book of the 2025 reading challenge that PewDiePie issued, and next month's book is In the Buddha's Words, which I am currently reading and will make another in-depth video for at the end of the month. I'm also trying to finish a novel I've been reading, and will make a video about that too if I finish it in time. So if you want to see more videos like this one and get my thoughts on different things, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you know when I post next. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like, as it will really help my channel grow. I hope you enjoyed this in-depth review, and I'll see you in the next video. Take care.